15 people today. Good turnout.
Very good.
Oh, there's Carrie.
I made it.
Excellent.
We're still waiting on Lynette.
I guess so. We're gonna give her like 10 minutes. Let me text Lynette. No word from Lynette. So why don't we go ahead and get started? Everybody's okay with that? So today is the Thursday, March 17th meeting of the Climate Change Committee. We'll call the meeting to order.
There's a message for you.
Nope, not her. Public comment. Members of the public are entitled to speak on matters of concern to the committee, but not on the agenda. I recognize everybody here, so I suspect we don't have any public comment. So we'll proceed on, oh, Nancy. I see Nancy waving her hand. Lynette will be here in a minute. Go ahead, Nancy.
My apology, you can cut me off if this is on agenda. I haven't looked at the agenda, but I was happy to see Ian Brandon's workshops next week with the Building and Architecture Committee that Anya's is going to be pitching about the issues and considerations for the building committee community coming up. So that's a good thing. And then also good that you guys got an incremental head coming up for next fiscal year to handle a lot of these projects that will be coming up. So just, kudos, thumbs up. All good stuff. Thanks.
Thank you, Nancy. So we should proceed on to the menu. The first item is review the draft climate change adaptation plan for Carmel. And I see Camilla and Ryan here. I assume, hello, one of you is going to take the lead on this. Hi, Camilla. Good to see you again.
Yeah, good to see you all.
Before you start, let me just say thank you so much for putting the report together. It looks great.
Oh, good. I'm glad you think so. Yeah, we're really happy to be back here again, and this time with a draft plan for you all to review. And so what I was thinking I could do is just give a brief overview of some of the new things in the plan, and we can go chapter by chapter and stop for any initial comments that any of you have off the bat. And knowing that I think you'll have a week or two to provide further comments on the plan. So no worries if you haven't had a chance to dive in quite yet. Let me just share my screen. Oh, think I need to be given access.
Okay, now you should be able to do it.
Here we go. Perfect. Thank you, Agnes. Okay, great. So the plan is really set up to be as concise as possible and really just support those large tables of adaptation goals, policies, and actions that we've gone over in previous climate committee meetings and public workshop. And I can go to the table of contents and kind of just point to these different sections that we have. So the introduction has a little bit on the city context and then a lexicon of the terms that are used in the document. So it describes kind of like a glossary of terms. We also speak to the climate adaptation plan process. So here we speak to some of the state process, the adaptation planning guide, which is what we use, well, what the city used to develop the vulnerability assessment, which was then used to build this plan. We also have the stakeholder and public input section. And this really just briefly summarizes the stakeholder input that was done in the last 6 or 7 months. And you'll see there's actually an appendix as well with outreach. That's where you can find all of the presentations and the response to comments that we had put together. The adaptation strategy kind of explains the strategy behind building those tables of adaptation goals, policies, and actions. And then this section, the adaptation policies and actions, this is where you'll see those tables that we worked on. You'll see that each action is listed under the appropriate policy, the climate hazard that it addresses, the asset or population that it protects or increases resilience for, the criteria that is addressed, so like engagement, partnerships, adaptive management, those sort of things, which are all described above. Potential metrics. So this will help with implementation of the plan. It helps give the city an understanding of what needs to be done to move towards achieving these actions, policies, and goals. The time frame, so near term, midterm, and long term. Implementation lead, also critical for implementation. And then cost, which is $1 sign for a lower cost, which is up to $24,000. And then medium cost, up to 50,000, and high cost, which is anything over 100,000. So you'll see that it's 3 separate tables for each goal. The first goal, as you'll remember, was the healthy, safe, and resilient community. So those are kind of with focused on the vulnerable populations. Spans multiple pages. It's our biggest table. We then move to the natural environment. And the last table is the resilient infrastructure and built environment. So I think I'll just pause for a second here to see if there are any quick comments or questions on those sections that I've covered so far. And we'll open it up again at the end for a larger discussion as well.
Anybody?
Yeah, I do have a few questions and comments on this part of the deck. I don't know if you want just the quick ones now or the longer ones at the end, or because I have like 5 or 6 questions and comments on this.
Let me ask, Scott, you have questions about the individual actions here?
Yes, exactly.
Okay, let me, if you don't mind, Camilla, first thing I'd like to ask you to do, if it's possible, and I think maybe Agnes conveyed this to you, perhaps we could go through, I have some issues too, some questions too, and perhaps we could go through this chart page by page rather than having everybody me and Scott ask our questions at once and then going back and forth. Would you be, I assume you'd be amenable to that? Yeah,
so you want to go through each action?
Yeah, and before we do that, I have sort of an overall, I have a sort of an overall question. The metric stuff is, the metric column is, I think, new here for today. And I'm trying to figure out for myself, you know, we're all used to sort of SMART goals, you know, specific, measurable, actionable, reachable, and time-based. And I'm trying to figure out, you know, whether metric and time frame are most of the metrics in here. Most of my questions about the things in this table were related to sort of the use of metrics versus the use of goals. So a metric says like how many houses are electrified, and a goal would be have half the houses electrified, you know, by the year 2040 or something like that. Do you know, like, how should I think about that? And I realize I'm putting you on the spot a little bit by asking you this question, but since the metrics aren't time-based, how do we as a committee sort of make sure that the city follows up on the things that we're recommending here?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think, so we did have metrics on at the previous meeting, but it wasn't for each action. And that was because we were focusing on the actions that show a measurable increase in resilience and a metric for that to show, like the example that you shared about electrifying a certain number of buildings. But what we found as we were doing internal reviews is that without some sort of metric for measuring if the action is being achieved, it's going to be difficult for the city to note if any progress is being made. And so we kind of added these other metrics like number of meetings held with Monterey Fire and CERT program. That's not really increasing your resilience per se, but it is a step towards achieving these actions. And so we just didn't want those actions without measurable resilience changes to be forgotten about, because they do provide a lot of support for the overall strategy. But I see what you're saying. I think that the term metric maybe is not the most appropriate for what all of what we've indicated as metrics are. And rather they're almost like steps for implementation. And so that could be something perhaps we could move to this. There's an appendix that we've added, which is an implementation tracking tool. And so maybe we keep those sorts of goals to the tracking tool rather than calling them metrics in this table.
Well, I was wondering if we should change this table, and I don't know the answer to this question. If we should establish, like, so I'm looking, an easy one off the plan is 1.1.2, which is update emergency preparedness, and the metric is number of block captains formed. And I'm wondering, like, so for example, if we should, rather than using the number of block captains formed, say that, you know, in 5 years, we want 25% of the landmass in Carmel to be covered by this emergency preparedness plan, and to, you know, to sort of say 5% a year starting in year 2. Now, I did have a conversation with Agnes about this sort of exact thing. And what Agnes said to me was maybe some of the goals, and I'm sure Agnes will correct me if I'm wrong, and please do. Some of the goals were sort of subject to be changed, like maybe we're jumping the gun on the number of block captains performed, but on number of block captains formed in terms of how we get to where we want to be 5 years from now. I'm not sure what the answer is. It's just that number of block captains formed seems really fuzzy to me, and it's not concrete towards getting to this action 1.1.2.
Right. So something I did discuss with Jeff is, because this is a new plan, this is new for the city of Carmel. I think we will learn a lot about implementation as we start doing the work. And so some of these goals, I think, can be refined in the next version of the plan as we start understanding a little better what it takes to implement some of these goals. So that was my take on it. I think some of them can probably be tightened up a bit, but generally speaking, I think allowing a little flexibility is good so that we can adapt as we begin implementation and we learn a little bit about the process as we begin implementing it.
Yeah, I think it is, you know, when we're working in adaptation and resilience, there's a lot of unknowns, right? There's a lot of things that we're not entirely sure how they're going to play out and what the future is going to look like. So it becomes really difficult to say, we need 10 block captains. I don't think anyone knows if 10 is the number, or if 20 is the number, or if 30 is the number. Like, that's going to be stuff we're going to have to kind of figure out. And in mitigation, everything's known. We know how many buildings there are. We know how much electricity or natural gas they use, and we know how many we need to electrify in order to get to our greenhouse gas target. Like, it's much more quantitative, and we're in this process now. I think just the state, maybe broader than that, the world is trying to figure out what the future looks like and how we're going to make these kind of, some ways, ethereal future possibilities more quantitative. And this is like a step in that direction where we're saying, oh, these are the things that at least we can count to know if we're making progress or not. So when we come back to this in 5 years, we can say, okay, we have 10 block captains and they're covering most of the city and people have been informed on all these different topics and we feel pretty good about that. Or, hey, we have 10 block captains, there's still half the city that doesn't have anyone. We need to increase this number and make it more specific. So that's kind of where we're coming from on this, is starting to get at that without just making up a number. And it kind of feels like just putting a number on number of block captains or number of meetings would be a little disingenuous, as far as we would just be guessing at this point.
It's Lynette.
Lynette?
I'm just wondering, as I look at this, whether the number of block captains formed is truly even a metric that demonstrates how we're moving toward this goal or this action. Because unless we have, and maybe we do, maybe you do, and I don't know that, so correct me if I'm wrong, unless we have a very clear definition of the responsibilities of block captains and the measurement of their success, just saying we have 10 block captains that cover 50% of the city may not, in fact, be a way of measuring our progress toward this goal. So is there a deeper look or a definition of what these block captains do and how we look at their success?
Yeah.
And I would say, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
No, and I would say to sort of extend what I think Lynette is sort of on to something. And I think it's more about sort of the amorphousness of that metric versus the amorphousness of that metric, or the sort of slightly missing the mark of that particular metric. I think when Lynette says we don't know what the block captain is, I think that's pretty much true, but we do have a CERT organization. And I think so maybe, so for example, in this case, you know, a metric might be give the CERT organization the task to do this, you know, to organize the city by blocks or to figure this out. And then a second goal might be to have 25% of the city covered, you know, 6 years from now or something like that. So sort of a two-step, so in this case, sort of a two-step metric that the first one establishes that we don't really know what we're doing. And the second one establishes some sort of amorphous goal as a result of the first one. Is that what you were saying, Lynette?
Yeah, in part, I think that that's in the direction of what I was saying. But when we say incorporate considerations into programming and materials, that seems to me to beg for more specificity, and that specificity would yield the metric. If we are specific about doing those things, if we are specific about how to incorporate that into the CERT programming and materials, then we will know how to measure it. So what does CERT need to do in order to do this, in order to accomplish this? And when we look then at what CERT has done, we should be able to say, yeah, they're on the mark, or, you know, we need more attention here or there. So I think, Jeff, you and I are getting at the same idea. My hope is that these metrics will be clear enough that the reader could say, I know what that action is, and I know how we're going to measure it, and I can observe how successful we are in diving toward that.
Yeah, I think these are all really great comments about implementation. And just so that, let me just speak to the block captains real quick. That's something specifically that we've seen work really well in other small cities. I work with the city of Rolling Hills, which is down in LA County, super small city. And the entire city is in the very high fire hazard severity zone. And they have set up these block captains that go door to door and do a lot of face-to-face preparedness programs that have worked very well for the community. That's mostly seniors, so, you know, don't want to be on the computer a lot and prefer kind of this face-to-face interaction. And so these things have worked really well in kind of similar small communities. So that's why it was added here as a potential metric. But I think that that's a great point, that the program is not built out here. The idea is that in the first year of implementation of this plan, this program is built out by the lead, which will, I mean, this is, I'm kind of jumping ahead, but by that climate coordinator or grant and grant writer that will be hired to help kind of coordinate this with the implementation leads listed in the table with police and fire. So that's kind of the way that we see it, is that these are going to be developed through implementation. And I also want to mention that we don't see this as like, okay, here's the plan, and in 5 years, what was done. It's like, here's the plan, and yearly there's going to be an annual report that talks about what was done on each of these actions. And if nothing was done, talking about the barriers to implementation, like why? Maybe that metric didn't work well, and we need to revise that before the next annual report. And we, you know, not revising the entire plan because that's kind of on a 5-year cycle. Mm-hmm. But I think annually updating metrics is a very good idea based on what's working and what's not working.
I would add that this is a living document. We don't have all the answers now, and we won't have all the answers next year. We're going to learn the answers as we implement. And I can't stress this enough, having been a planner for a long time. You continue learning as you implement these plans. And this is a massive undertaking. And the more, what we want to do is we want to get started with implementation, because we will continue to learn as we start implementing. So I don't want us to get too bogged down into trying to define everything very precisely, because we're not really going to be, there may be some things we can clarify a little more, but we're not going to have all the answers until we start doing the work. And it's a frustrating thing about planning, but it's also a really good thing about planning that we learn as we implement, for sure. It's definitely something we just, you know, I want everybody to sort of keep in mind that this will be a living document, and this, you know, it's definitely going to change as we go.
So let me ask let me ask you, Anya, let me ask you and Camilla a question. And I'm picking on action 1.1.2 for no particular reason. So the text under action says incorporate climate change risk and impact considerations, yada, yada, yada. And the thing that Lynette and I are talking about is we don't really know if like the metric's right, or it doesn't really hold anybody's feet to the fire, or yada, yada, yada. But that action in action 1.1.2 hasn't been done yet. So there is a goal. So somewhere in the text of action 1.1.2, there is something that needs to be done. And I think it's kind of laid out in the verbiage of the action, right? So is it the time frame that establishes when that thing is supposed to be done? So we've talked before about next year, next 3 years, next 5 years, next 10 years. Does near term mean that we expect action 1.1.2 to be done like by the end of 2023 or something like that?
Correct. And I would say for that one in particular, we could add a metric that says climate change risk and impacts incorporated into certain materials. I think that would be a good additional metric to have with the number of block captains for it, because between the two of them, then there should be an increase in knowledge at the neighborhood level of climate change risks and potential impacts.
Okay. I think that sounds like, for this one, I think that sounds like a good idea. And the only thing then that I would ask in terms of this conversation before my concerns are sort of allayed would be that we be a little more precise about what near term and midterm mean, so that as we sort of progress down in time, so that like if we're doing this review in the year 2024, update emergency preparedness doesn't still say midterm, like it's going to be done in the next year, even though we may not have gotten any work done. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So somewhere in this chart, maybe like by near term, it could say, I don't know. I don't know exactly how to do that, but you see what I'm like, let's not have rolling deadlines that just roll down the near term slope as we roll down the calendar,
We could put in fiscal years if we want to do that.
Put in what? I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
But we could put in fiscal years.
Fiscal years. Mm-hmm. Or we could kind of define upfront what we mean by, like we have with the nice symbols for climate hazard.
It is defined up front, but I see Jeff's thought that if I pick up the plan 2 years from now and I think near term, then I'm going to think it's 2 years
Right.
out from now.
Right.
So I get what Jeff is saying with that.
Mm-hmm.
So I think maybe a date associated with the metric or somewhere around there would probably be more helpful for us to sort of track it. I mean, people are not going to, people are going to look at these 12 pages. They're not really going to understand, going back and forth is going to will lead to some cognitive dissonance, and people will tune it out and just say, oh, that's the next year. So I think that would be great. So should we just, if there are no more questions, pain in the ass questions like mine, should we just go down the chart page by page? Scott, are you still with us?
Here, yes, sounds good to me.
So any comments on this page? I have one. My comment was that we have 3 pages from now, there's a resilience hub. And I think that the resilience hub, which I think we've talked about a fair amount, and which I think is a good idea. I think up to this point, we've only talked about it being sort of a physical resilience hub. And I was wondering if we should expand the definition a little bit to be sort of a virtual resilience hub as well. I don't know, my thoughts were that we could have a place on the Carmel City website. It could be resilience.ca.carmel, whatever that whole URL is. And we could sort of put this information along with the information that's 3 pages from now where we talked about the actual resilience hub on 1.2.1, where we could fill that sort of website with information that relates to all the things that are listed on this page. And I know we're going to talk about this a little bit later when we talk about like the sustainability committee or the climate change committee or whatever it is we're going to do. Maybe it could be a website owned by, I don't know exactly how that would work, but I think there might be a virtual component to this as well.
That's a great idea. To have that on the city's website.
Yeah, and it could be, yeah.
No, go ahead.
No, I was just, just back to, I don't know, again, I don't know whether it be resilience.carmel or sustainability.carmel, but something like that. And maybe by the end of this discussion, when we've talked about future plans, we'll have a little bit better idea of what we might try.
Yeah, that sounds great. Any other comments on this page? And remember that you can also submit comments after the meeting. If you, don't feel stressed if you don't have a comment yet. Okay, so this is page 18, the next page. Any comments here? Evacuation, alternatives and access, updating city planning guidelines, development standards, and develop local partnerships to increase resistance to wildfire structure damage.
My only comment here was that city planning guidelines 1.1.7, we do that every year, don't we, Agnes? I know that, and Carrie, we just did that. Don't we do this every year? Or every other year, we bring the city building code into compliance with whatever the California building code is. Is that exactly what this thing is?
We do adopt the building code every couple of years. However, we do have some planning guidelines that are somewhat in conflict with the building code. And I think that's what this is getting at. So this effort that the planning department is currently undertaking to update the design guidelines would help us meet this action actually.
Is that, Agnes, so I'm trying to understand maybe the difference between 1.1.7 and 1.1.8, because 1.1.7 only references the, is the city's municipal code consistent with the state building code?
We do, we do adopt the building code, but we do have some design guidelines that are sort of conflicting at the planning level related to, and I can't, because I'm not a planner and I have.
Okay, I think I understand.
I think there were some things with like garage designs that were where.
ADUs were another one.
ADUs, yeah. So there are a couple of different ways to look at it, but I think one was more building oriented. And then I think the development standards was looking more at the landscaping requirements.
Okay, so I think I understand what the difference is. I think to Nancy's point about ADUs, we actually are in compliance with the ADU law by not having an ADU law. So ADUs are something that we just grab this sort of state supplied code and implement that. And that's what we've been doing. So we are in compliance with the ADU law. But I see what Agnes is, I see what you're saying about other parts. And so perhaps rather than saying city municipal code consistent with current California codes, we could put a date on here and maybe slightly better understand, maybe task the design review people or Brandon's team, that effort that's gearing up to sort of identify these places where we're out of consistency. Like maybe 2 years from now, we'll have a list of the things that we need to fix.
Yeah,
and
we
they
do.
hopefully will have been fixed.
And there are some things with materials, especially, fire, with materials where the planning guidelines are a little bit out of sync with the state building code standards. So, yes, we can definitely do that.
So I think some dates and some slightly more concrete metrics here about what we're going to do and when we're going to do it. I think that would be my comment on those.
Sounds good. I also want to add that I've been working a lot with CAL FIRE recently because there have been so many changes to state legislation regarding wildfire and planning for it. And they really recommend this sort of action in safety elements. So it's a little different. It's not a climate adaptation plan, but their point is that the California code changes. So if you put a date on it, sometimes it makes the action, it's just easier to make the plan out of date, because as the California code changes, the city should continue to make sure that the municipal code maintains consistency with the state code. But I think we should absolutely put a date on this, and especially in the near term spot, I just would be worried about putting a date on the action and have that action be kind of like, oh, that's done, and you know,
taken off the list.
Right, exactly.
That all sounds good to me.
Okay, so I'm going to move on to the next page, which is page 19. So this is policy 1.2, focus adaptation efforts and engagement on the most vulnerable populations. So here we have the resilience hub that you were talking about, Jeff, and I have a note here on what you said earlier on the first page. Also limiting impacts of climate change on the most vulnerable populations. And this is to develop a framework to define equity in Carmel-by-the-Sea and develop adaptation approaches that are equitably implemented. Engaging the community, social support network for the community, and backup power for vulnerable populations.
Comments on this page? I just have one related to, and Camilla, you might be able to help me, related to 1.2.5. There are people in town that have sort of emergency medical equipment that are obviously reliant on the grid. Would it be sort of standard practice for us to know who those people are as a vulnerable community? So does that make sense?
Yeah, I think, Anis, were you gonna, looks like you.
I'm sorry?
I thought we had an action that included figuring out who is at risk as part of our emergency response.
Yeah, I thought there was one about developing a list of folks who needed this, and I don't know off the top of my head.
I'm pretty sure it's in there. I don't know exactly which one it is, but I'm pretty sure it's in there.
But I'm going to write that down and find it, or if not, add it to this action here.
You talk about it in action 1.2.4.
Right above.
Right above.
Inventory of locations with isolated elderly residents and people with disabilities. There it is.
There you go.
Yeah, so I think it's mostly in 1.2.4. Maybe the language in 1.2.4 needs to be expanded just a tiny bit to include the whole electrical stuff. People who are really at risk as opposed to at risk.
Yeah.
You still okay, Scott?
Yeah, it might come up later, my comments.
Okay.
Could we go back to that page? It's Lynette. I had, on on 1.2.3, the engage the community, I would be a little unsatisfied if distribution of educational materials annually was the only metric of our community engagement under this. I think that that's a great one to have, but I think it is way narrow and maybe quite surface, as opposed to something that would be more indicative of engagement.
Yeah.
Do you have an example of what you're looking for, Lynette?
Well, aside from distributing materials, I'm wondering about connections with specific community organizations and the kind of things that we had initially talked about with either CRA or the foundation, where those already existing entities have good outreach, and that we work through those organizations as a way of engagement. It could be, I don't know whether the chamber plays a place in this kind of engagement or not, maybe not, but there is a business community and then there is a residential community, and the engagement seems to me to be appropriate in both.
And the engagement could be not only materials distributed, but it could be social media. It could
Exactly.
be, mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think just distributing educational materials isn't fulsome enough for describing how we would like for the community to be engaged.
If only the city had a social media plan, Carrie.
Well, there you go.
Poke.
What'd you say? Poke. Yeah.
I would add to Lynette's comments that the chief of police and chief of fire have done almost annual sessions, and those have been really good. And as a part of CRA, I promote those things and go to those things, et cetera. And we definitely should continue that. And then push organizations like CRA and Foundation and the Chamber to not only promote it, but summarize and provide reference materials on an annual basis, and maybe in conjunction with what the chiefs roll out. So if that could be a trickle down of that annual process, that would be great, because we'd all support it. Just exactly like you said, Lynette.
What are those annual sessions called?
I could dig up the last one.
What I would say to Lynette and Nancy's comments is, especially to Lynette, education materials distributed is kind of thin, which I agree with, having heard her say it, is that I'm not sure how to make it thicker. So maybe the goal for the first year is to figure out how to develop a community engagement plan.
I love that. I think that's great.
So rather than having the metric be implement this one little part of the plan, maybe the metric really needs to be, develop a community engagement plan to support this resilience hub, or whatever it is that the community engagement plan is responsible for.
Yep.
And that could be one of the, do in the next year sort of things if Carrie and I are successful at getting this person hired.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Thank you, Lynette.
All right, I'm going to move to the next page. We have actions under policy 1.3, minimizing health impacts of climate change. First one is partnering with Monterey County Health Department, initiating a heat pump retrofit program, investing in improving resilience in critical facilities, conducting a feasibility study for existing building electrification and backup power, and improve resilience in existing building stock. Any comments on this one?
I would just say that 1.3.1 seems to belong, and I'm not suggesting we move it, but it seems to belong with the Resilience Hub sort of efforts. And maybe there could be like a little wordy link somewhere in there that points the 1.3.1 reader back to 1.2.1, where that material would be sort of kept up to date or fleshed out. I don't know what the right yeah, I don't know. Any more, Lynette?
Yes, on 1.3.4, I really like this idea of a feasibility study for the existing buildings and backup power. I think that having the study completed and not just completed, but part of the metric is presented to the city council by whatever that midterm fiscal year definition is. I feel that that puts the pressure a bit on to say it's not just a study that's going to be done sometime, but that there's a product ready for presentation to the city council for action. Because one of the things we said as a committee very early on is that we wanted to really put some action focus on all of our ultimate recommendations, and to have some kind of reporting requirement or presentation requirement seems to me in some of these actions to be a really good idea.
Thank you.
I agree with her comments.
Great. All right, I'll move on to the next page where we have building electrification. And this one links to the climate action plan, as the climate action plan does have an action for building electrification, promoting funding opportunities. And then it's the start of policy 1.4, which is increasing economic resilience. A lot of focus on developing partnerships to provide support to displaced workers, and establishing partnerships to develop a resilient economy. Pause for a minute for any comments on this one.
I feel like I may be beating a dead horse, but on 1.4.1, the number of meetings held to establish support for displaced workers doesn't feel to me like a way to measure our progress. It's, we could have 20 meetings and really be making no headway. What are those, whatever number of meetings intended to produce, to result in? And maybe to Agnes's point from before, we may not necessarily know at this moment, but is there some way in the ones, if we truly say we don't know, is there some way to clarify that so that the reader understands that this is a period of either exploration or definition or some other measure of progress toward achieving the goal?
Great comment. I think you really nailed it with that one, that it's really unknown and there aren't a lot of examples yet in the state. And we were talking a lot about, in a previous meeting that, Carmel could really be a leader in this space. And that comes with, you can't do it all on your own, especially as a
Right.
small city. And, what does the city really have control over? But your point is well taken. And I think that, it's going to be really important as these meetings get set up, that there's a very deliberate kind of agenda set, and then goals set in partnership with these partners themselves, rather than the city coming up with the plan for implementing this on their own.
Yeah, I think the challenge with this one is we really don't know if the businesses want to take this on. And I was going to ask Camilla if she had experience with other cities on this one, and it looks like the answer is no. So I think the problem with this one is we don't know how big the bread box is. So it's really hard, and we really don't know how committed the chamber and the businesses are to this. And I think that's really part of what the metric needs to be, is the business community committed to doing this? So that's kind of, that's my feeling on this one.
That's almost an initial step, is to determine the uptake, if you will.
Right.
Whether anybody's going to rise to this occasion. I think it's easy to feel that if whatever happens here would displace workers, well, they'll just go somewhere else. And in fact, that may or may not be the case. So I think it is presenting a strong case to the business community to have that kind of grasp of the importance.
I think the test case was the last 2 years with COVID, where we really saw a lot of people go elsewhere to other communities. So I think your point's well taken as well. So I don't know how we can tighten this one up, I guess.
Yeah, I think we run into this problem a lot, when we talk about, for example, residential electrification, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. We don't, the committee and the city ultimately sort of takes a view that buildings need to be electrified for a specific reason. And in the case of electrification, is to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions and to improve the environment in which people live by eliminating gas out of people's homes. And there's a line there between sort of the city dictating that you will do this because we think you will do this, and sort of getting people to buy in. But I think it's important, sort of to Carrie's point, I personally think it's important that the city sort of say, these are the things that are important to us. And so the action in one point, even though we may not know what the business community is capable of doing with regards to 1.4.1 and 1.4.2, I think it's important that we leave them in there and signify that they're important goals that we think, as a committee or as a city, that they're important goals that we would like sort of the greater Carmel community to meet. And even if we have to even if number of meetings held to establish support isn't exactly the right metric, to Lynette's point, we should still, maybe it needs to develop a plan, something more along those lines, and develop a plan to provide support for displaced workers, for example, something like that.
Yeah.
And since it's midterm, give it 2 or 3 years, but the sustainability committee or the sustainability manager or whatever would sort of have that as that medium-term goal that needs to be done by the middle of 2025.
I'm wondering if the goal at this point should be to get commitment from the business community to implement this project. as opposed to, I mean, as opposed to jumping straight to developing the plan, maybe our goal at this point should be getting commitment from the business community to work with the city on avenues, opportunities to support displaced workers. Because I think that's going to be our first step, is we're going to need to get that commitment before we can develop that plan.
I think that's a good point.
And what I would say, that sounds good to me. And what I would suggest then is maybe the time frame could be tightened up a little bit.
Right.
So whereas the time frame on this thing for basically doing all this work was 3 to 5 years, maybe the time frame on developing a plan would be 1 to 2 years. So maybe, for example, the middle of the end of the 2023-2024 fiscal year, for example, if we're doing things by fiscal year. Maybe we could bring the time frame in a little bit if we're changing the metric a little bit.
And I would add to that, not just to supplement what you guys were just talking about, that the worker population could also include those beyond those that have a storefront of some sort in the city, because it could include care workers or people that clean and others that go beyond the storefront folks. So how we get a handle on that, it beats the heck out of me, but that's an additional challenge.
Yeah, Nancy, that's so true. One of the things at least I personally have struggled with, is the number of workers who are not traditionally employed, and they make up a large number in our community, and we can't ignore that. We have to figure out a way to connect into that part of our worker population. And maybe that's
Great.
part of not just the engagement of the traditional business community, but more contractors who don't necessarily have a business here in Carmel, but serve the Carmel community, and then all of those independent people who just come in and do work.
Great.
Thanks for all those comments. And then this last page for policy 1.4, business resilience outreach program, and then hiring a grant writer / climate coordinator, which is quite key to the plan implementation.
I really cry to think that that is long-term, 1.4.4. I feel like that should be near-term. And if we make it long-term, which is pushing it so far out, for me, it jeopardizes other things. And I realize it's something that, to Jeff's point before, Jeff and Carrie are going to have to fight hard for. I just feel like putting that as a long-term time frame, I just don't feel like that's right.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I was just going to add one other, more of a question on that one, where it says this is for climate adaptation. Would this position not also be scoped for climate action, or are we really trying to limit it here?
It
Seems like it would be both.
It could be for both.
Okay, thank you.
What do you think, Agnes?
Yeah, that'd be great to have someone else who can help with that.
I think also, to go back to the previous conversation, adding 1.4.3, sort of that near-term goal, we might as well just lump it in with the rest of the outreach to the business community and sort of see what happens. Does that make sense?
I agree.
That makes sense.
I agree.
So change the metric, then change the time frame.
Maybe part of the sales proposition, if you will, of getting this new position approved, getting people on board with the importance of it, is the way it's described. And I don't know that grant writer, maybe that is a big attractive term. I think we need to think long and hard about what has the most psychological appeal and the greatest chance of getting acceptance, because on the face of it, it declares its importance. And grant writing and getting money to do a lot of these things is obviously a big deal. I don't mean to undervalue that at all. But I would like for us to think, and Camilla, you guys probably know lots of job titles that are out there that give a good indication of what the person is doing that is really high value. So I would just like to ask that, because I think how it appears, words mean something.
Yeah, I would also add, we might want to update the action 1.4.4 description to reflect what is stated in the implementation section of the report, because we do, I think, go into a bit more detail about what that person would do in that section.
Okay.
And it is quite a bit more than just applying for grants.
Absolutely. And that's what I would hope that the words would communicate.
Budget season is here, so time is short on this.
We need the help.
Should we move on?
Okay, we are on the natural environment goal. So policy 2.1, protect and restore climate vulnerable habitat and ecosystems. And the actions here are increasing funding for climate adaptation, increase urban forest resilience, and increasing resilience of the Mission Trail Nature Preserve. These were pulled, you'll probably remember, pretty directly from the vulnerability assessment that was completed.
So yeah, I have a comment on action 2.13. This might be again about whether it's position, but I see wildfire reduction as work that's already happening. We've done a lot this year, a lot of fire fuel reduction. There was a grant we received. The city's done a whole lot. So we're kind of almost up to date. So it's sort of ongoing, which tells me this is not a long-term thing. It's now. I think there is a need to maybe formalize it and make sure it continues to happen year after year. So maybe there's some kind of institutionalization of that. And then I guess we also maybe want to codify it in the Mission Trail Nature Preserve master plan. And then that goes beyond fire, it goes into habitat and things like that. So there are kind of two things in there. We just wouldn't want to lose, and people think we're not going to do anything about fire for term. We're on that, and we're going to continue that, I think.
Yes, I think specifically that measure had to do with updating the master plan, because the master plan really doesn't talk a whole lot about wildfire mitigation. It's something that has been sort of really taken on as we've realized that we needed to do it, and we do, and we actually do quite a bit of it. But it would be good to update the master plan to sort of reflect the current conditions and what we expect the future conditions to look like. But yeah, we do quite a bit of work actually in that.
Yeah, and I agree on the updating. I just think we could easily do that piece around the fire bit now. We don't have to wait to sort out some of these more complex, nuanced habitat management questions. It's a little bit of a different topic.
So what I would suggest as a council member is that 2.1.2 is in fact in progress or is getting ready to start. Right, Anya. So I want to see Anya shaking her, nodding her head. So
correct.
And so maybe 2.1.3 could be, we could assign a date like less short term and more medium term for getting that done. I don't think it's really wise to try to update the master plan, the Mission Trail master plan, while we're doing the forest master plan. I think that's just too much for everybody to do. But maybe, so my first comment would be maybe we could sequentially organize them so that the Mission Trail one, was in fact the master plan. And I'm going to look at Carrie for what she thinks is right here, but maybe we could schedule that. So the forest one will be done, a year from now. So that will be mid 2023. So maybe the Mission Trail Nature Preserve one could be done 2024, 2025. We could just sort of sequentially schedule it at the end. That's my first comment to what do people think about that?
That makes sense to me.
And then my second comment would be, this action 2.1.2 and 2.1.3, they talk about updating the plans, but they don't really talk about implementing the plans. And I think it's worthwhile to have separate actions here that call out sort of the maintenance that those plans call on the city to do. And the action would basically be do the maintenance that you're required to do every year. And I'm hoping that, the forest management plan will have something in that by the time we're finished, pay attention to the dead trees, for example, and the metric would be, did we pay attention to the dead trees? So we can track that. This will be a good place to sort of formalize the tracking of these plans that the city has historically been pretty terrible at doing. Does that make sense?
I think it makes sense. And I believe it speaks to Scott's point about there is a lot of work already going on. And part of the metric might be some kind of reporting on the activities that are underway and continue, so that there's, the specific evidence of what the Mission Trail Nature Preserve group are doing, and then what the city is doing, because it's both. And the same thing on 2.1.2, that there are reports about what is happening in the interim.
So I would
not just a plan.
Right. I would note that there is a CD. So for those projects who have CDPs, which that includes Mission Trail Nature Preserve and the North Dunes, we do annual reports. So these projects are being tracked already fairly closely. The Urban Forest Resilience Plan is a little bit different because that covers the whole city. That's not a CDP directed, because it's not really a project. Mission Trail and North Dunes are more like projects, so they are CDP covered by CDP. For the Forest Resilience Plan, this will be something that the Forest and Beach Commission really should focus on, and I'm not sure whether reporting on this separately in two different sort of tracks is the way we want to go with this.
Well, this kind of gets at one of my comments in the document that I sent you with some preliminary comments, Jeff and Carrie and Agnes, and that is the accountabilities and the responsibilities of various commissions for pieces of this work and how that all gets coordinated. So I hear what you're saying. I think that finding a way to make it non-redundant, but to put it at the place that it should be in order to have accountability both for doing the work and for assuring that the reporting is done on doing the work, so there's evidence of movement in achieving these metrics. Did that make sense?
Yes. Should we hold that thought until we talk about the implementation?
Yes. Okay. It's just it's just
Yes.
one of the evidences.
Yep.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay.
So Camilla, you're totally clear. What's
I'm
going
taking lots of notes over here, everyone. Okay, next page here. We have the actions: increase resilience of the North Dunes, increase resilience to stronger storms, beach sand monitoring program, and Carmel Cove sand supply.
Would the sand supply analysis not go with the first thing on the next page, which is the, I guess it's not on the next page, the sea level rise coastal vulnerability study? Is that not part of that? 3.1.8.
It should be done. It should probably be done in coordination with it. But I think the engineering studies sort of focuses more on our assets, whereas the beach, you know, they're, I think they work together, but we ended up putting the beach sand supply under natural environment because it focuses more on the beach, whereas the engineering study would focus more on the assets, well, both the dunes, but then also the constructed assets along the coast.
Okay, that's a good answer for me. Thank you.
Okay, if there are any other initial comments on this page, I'll move down to resilient infrastructure and built environment. This is our last larger goal. And this page shows policy 3.1, support greater resilience, redundancy, and reliability of local and regional infrastructure in the built environment. So this one has undergrounding utilities in fire hazard zones, increase green infrastructure, reduce stormwater runoff, and storm drain repair funding and improvements.
I'll make one comment here, and this might be out of context, but I hear that we have 900 million of PG&E funds that are about to expire, and that would be, I believe, for undergrounding. And it kind of makes me feel like if that's the case, that would be an awfully urgent thing. It's not so much near term, it's now. If that really is the case, I could be off the mark here, but I heard from someone who probably would know these things, and that's what they told me.
I wonder who that was.
It's
So
actually
you guys can leave that if you want. I know, I felt like I had to at least mention it just in case that really was the case, that we were at risk of losing $900 million from G&E.
it's
And when
actually
you say we, do you mean the city?
The city, yes.
okay. So let's get the number right. It's 900,000.
Oh, that's, sorry, 900,000. Yeah.
Okay.
Apologies.
Oh,
Way off the mark here.
Yeah. So
I
some
deal
of
with millions of work.
900 million would be great.
Yeah, apologies.
But some of that was discussed at our strategic plan meeting last week, and that people are talking about it. Unfortunately, 900,000 is not a lot, but the suggestion was maybe starting in Mission Trail as a way to utilize some of that money. So that is being talked about.
Oh, good. Okay. Yeah, no streets to dig up there. So I would think 900,000 would get us fairly, make a dent, hopefully.
900,000 wouldn't go very far in a street issue, right, Jeff?
Go a third of a mile.
Mm-hmm. So.
I've talked to staff a tiny bit about not losing that money, so I'm sort of on it, Scott. But there's still exploration to do with PG&E about what exactly the terms of the dollars, those $900,000 are, and sort of all that, and what we can spend the money on, and how difficult it would be hooking up existing services to it and all that. But I would comment, Anyos, this is one of those things, or Camilla, this is one of those things where it says feasibility, we need a date on the feasibility study completed. So
can I just ask when those funds expire, if anybody knows?
Nobody, that's TBD. So I've sort of taken it on, but I don't have an answer yet. But I think we do need a date in 3.1.1, whether it's a year or two out. You know, I don't know how long it will take at this point. So maybe 2 years.
That would assume starting this coming year. Maybe give it 3 years.
I think the first year of the work is just going to be conversations with PG&E. Sure, you can give it 3 years. We can always pull it in.
Next page here has retrofit existing critical buildings and related infrastructure, water conservation, and bluff structural monitoring program.
I think that to the point that Lynette, I'll just save Lynette the trouble of having to bring this up. I think that to the point that Lynette has been bringing up, we don't really know what the existing critical buildings and related infrastructure are. So maybe the first thing should be develop that list rather than having that metric that we have on there.
And then if we do that, then we would need to change the time frame because we don't want.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, that's work that can be done from an office. So maybe in the next, you know, assuming we get this person hired, maybe in the next year we could have this done.
One of the things that I find myself being confused about is water conservation, because when we talk about it, we were always hearing, you know, Carmel has done such a great job. Our water demand has been reduced so much. What are we actually getting at that would reduce our water, and by how much are we targeting that reduction? I see the things that are listed under 3.1.6. Are we prioritizing any of those? Are we saying that they're all on the table to be explored? And if they are, then what are we, are there any incentives to do any of those? We can provide information and incentives, but what would those be? Do we know, or are we just saying we would explore that?
Yeah, I think the Peninsula Water Management District does provide some incentives. For, generally speaking, mostly smaller systems, we would have to do a little bit of research on whether there are any other entities that provide larger incentives. Mm-hmm. And then the information, some information is already out there, but really hasn't gotten to our residents. Right. Say, for example, gray water reuse. If you remember, we did have a discussion at one of our meetings about that. And we could stand to do a little bit more outreach to our community about what's out there and what requires a permit, what doesn't require a permit, what options are available.
Right.
So there are some, and then in terms of stormwater capture, I think there's also more outreach that could get out there. I'm not aware of any incentives per se, but you know, that would be part of the effort, would be to maybe one, to figure out if there's anything else out there that we are not aware of, and then two, maybe work with the Monterey Peninsula Water Management District on whether they may be amenable to developing something like that. And I don't know at the moment whether they would be or not, but they might be interested.
I think a lot of our discussion was encouraging people to go toward stormwater. I mean, Lynette's right. We do a great job of and have, reducing our water demand. But I think it was the idea of encouraging people to do more storm water capture and gray water reuse. And that's where I think that we could be doing a better job with this action item.
I agree with all those comments that maybe we could sort of rework this, and what it sounds like to me is that we should rework this and maybe be a little more concrete about what our goals are with regards to rainwater and gray water.
Yeah, I would actually add a metric to this one of outreach developed and shared, and also incentives developed and shared with the community, and not just water demand reduced, because that's sort of, if it's going to be based on outreach and incentives, it sometimes, the water demand doesn't necessarily sort of line up 100% with that. So I think we need those additional metrics.
Thank you.
I agree.
Yes.
All right. Next page has the sea level rise coastal vulnerability study that we just discussed minutes ago, and wastewater treatment. And then we go into policy 3.2, incorporate climate change adaptation into relevant plans and standards, developing a guidance project checklist, and incorporating climate change adaptation into local plans.
So I had a comment on this first one, 3.18. I'm wondering if we don't have enough focus on the goal on this one. I see study as a means to start moving towards a goal, which is around determining adaptation measures and LCP options. While considering our legal liabilities, armoring and building regulations, real estate disclosures, there's a whole bunch of stuff that I see as the goal. And I see this as a pretty long-term effort. I know just the study itself is near-term. And I went back and listened to the recording from the last month, which I had missed. We were talking about next planning and around maybe having a meeting, every 2 months around this. But I can see that, and it might only last a year. I can see that for the study, but just the first step to get us towards the goal, which is a pretty complex one. It's going to, in my thinking, would be multi-year effort. And I just don't want to lose people on what we're trying to do here. I think people are going to get bored when they hear study. This has a very important reason behind it that needs to get elevated in my mind.
I agree with that. And I think that we had talked about, I agree that sea level rise vulnerability study completed is an order of magnitude too wishy-washy for us. And I think that we had talked about producing a, whatever the immediate successor to this committee is, either whether it's this committee or some other group, producing a 1.1 version of this report that included, that included this sea level rise coastal vulnerability study, and sort of went from there to sort of expand this report a little bit. So I think that that's what, I think that was sort of the near-term goal. Is that right? And I think Carrie and I were going to go to bat to try and get this done this year in the capital improvement project budget. So hopefully that will happen. And then to Scott's point about the sort of longer term things, I don't know exactly. I agree that we need to do it. There's a lot of work to do here, but I'm concerned that we don't know what the work is yet. And we won't know until we do that vulnerability study. Like to me, it just seems like a big, huge hole right now.
That's where I think it's really important how we think about this coastal engineer, not just a coastal engineer to do the engineering part, someone who understands planning in an LCP context. They can help us navigate what is, I see, quite a complex path. So I think it's going to be important that we find someone that has the ability to think about this complex environment, not just from the geology, but from the policy side.
Well, that's what this committee supposedly is doing, right?
Well, I see this as a unique, complex policy question around, these longer term challenges associated with sea level rise. You might have to have phasing and all these different things, and there's state activities going on. I don't know we have that in house in my thinking. I think we can use the help from they are out there, I understand, that have specific experience with helping cities navigate this challenge. I wouldn't want to see a study that's just purely geology. I think we totally miss the boat if we do that.
Do you think that we should add a big ticket action item here? So 3.1.8 and then 3.1.8B, or the new 3.1.9, which would be generate version 1.1 of this adaptation report and then make policy recommendations based on that. Like, would that satisfy you?
I don't know if I completely follow that. I mean, I'm thinking we need to have the goals stated of where we're trying to go, and then there might be a first step here to hire an engineer that can help us with this study in an LCP context. That step, so it's just kind of turning it around. It's, we might have the same near-term objective, but I just don't want people to lose sight of the bigger.
Do you guys
challenge.
just want to add a number 4 under that action that says update the climate adaptation plan based on the results of the study, and then have that as a metric, the climate adaptation plan updated based on the results of the vulnerability study?
I think what I would say is that the headings are reversed. The heading should be generate version 1.1 of the climate adaptation study. And the first thing should be what's listed here as action 3.1.8, which is to do this coastal vulnerability, to hire the engineer and do the coastal vulnerability study. Does that make sense? I think
that would help.
That's what I'm reading Scott is saying. Like, we know that we need to do 3.1.8, but why exactly are we doing 3.1.8? And I would say it's to generate the version 1.1 of the report that we're doing, which would then lay out all the things. That version 1.1 of the report would then have actions in it, just like what we've done here, which would relate to sea level rise. And to Scott's point about, like, for example, just to choose one point, which is about the real estate disclosures, that would be in the version 1.1 of the report. That would be a new action item. Like, I think we can all see that there might be a real estate disclosure involved here, but I think we should wait until this committee sees the results of that oceanographical work to put that on paper. Like, there's a huge policy debate behind that. Like, and I don't think we're ready to. I don't think we're quite ready to put that onto a piece of paper yet.
I agree that we should have the higher level matter, as you just described, Jeff stated, and then the study is a vehicle to work toward that. I feel that having it here in this plan buries it. And it's almost the elephant in the room, as we have talked in the committee, that this work doesn't talk about sea level rise. Well, that is such a big thing to this community that it feels to me that it somehow, I don't know if it's pulled out of this and given its own feature in this report, that, we didn't do sea level rise. Here's what we're thinking about it, and here's what the action items are related to it. Because if it's 3.1.8 or 9 or 3 or whatever, it's just one of a list of many things that could be considered to be relatively equal, and it's definitely not. So I'm just wondering more about how it's presented now that we've discussed what should be presented.
What do you think, Agnes and Camilla? I see some begrudged smiles on these tiny little faces.
Come on, cough it up.
I think.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, off the bat, I think, it seems that most of these metrics, it's more useful in this plan to have them be these near-term goals for achieving a larger, I think sea level rise is a huge undertaking. I also think there are many other aspects of the plans that are going to be, of this plan that will be huge undertakings, and you have to take little steps towards it. I think what is missing from this action is underneath saying, use the results from the vulnerability study to inform the local coastal program update, to inform, version 1.1 of the adaptation report, so that it's not lost, because each of these actions will be reported on annually. And so having that language in there, I think, will not bury it. This will need to be reported on annually and shared with the Planning Commission or City Council. And
yeah, and it's not the only action that's not fully defined yet, where we're, the result of the action will lead to more actions in the future, where as we update a plan or as we develop a plan, then there will be more actions as a result of them. So I don't think it's that unique. It's a bigger, in terms of its importance, I think it has significance, obviously, and real importance, because we really need to understand that better. But I don't know that it needs to be pulled out of that table as something different, because I think all of these actions, as we start putting them together, will define new actions in the future. So it's just, I would add a couple of metrics to that action to, update the LCP based on the results, and then update the climate adaptation plan based on the results of the study. And we can put a timeline on that as well.
So I've listened to, let me give you my perspective. I've listened to Lynette and Scott and Agnes and Camilla, and I'm more on Lynette and Scott's side, basically, about, especially Lynette's side, about sort of elevating. I think what Lynette is saying is sort of to elevate this out of the table a little bit. Is that right? Like there should be some verbiage.
Yeah.
The text of the report that sort of surrounds the table should be a little clearer that this is something that we consider to be really important that we didn't really get to.
Right.
And it should be like, maybe this action should be action 1, but instead it's action 3.1.8, sort of down near the end. And we should try to find a way to call it out. So in the interest of sort of moving on to get to the next thing, how about, and I know I talked to Scott a little bit about this a couple of days ago when I ran into him. How about Scott and Lynette, would you be willing to work with Agnes and Camilla to sort of fix this up to your likings?
Okay.
Sure.
How about have a potential option that might work for everybody? What if we add a section in the implementation to highlight the fact that we want to do this vulnerability study to help update the plan? So it would be called out more in the implementation section as opposed to changing this table per se, but really calling it out in the implementation section as a critical next step potentially. Would that give it the gravitas?
I don't know.
Or we can work on it offline.
Yeah, I don't know whether it would. I feel like maybe having it in this as an action item is okay. Putting it in implementation is really important, but I would also like to see some clarity in the language, in the body of language about what we did not do and why it's important for it to be done. I just feel the coast, a community on the ocean that doesn't talk about that is not doing fully what it should be doing.
Are you okay with that, Carrie? What Lynette is suggesting?
Yes.
Why don't we? I would. Maybe I should I'll just repeat my ask that we
I'll
sort
do
of
it,
give this
sure.
to Lynette. Give this to Lynette and Scott, and let Lynette and Scott work with Agnes and Camilla to sort of get it to their liking.
Okay, I'm good.
Great. Yeah, thanks for your comments. I'd be scared to. I'm glad you said you're okay with keeping it in the table as well as doing those other things, because the implementation tracking tool is just the table. So if we take it out, it's harder to track implementation. But yeah, I've written down notes and happy to chat offline with you all about this. We also have a data gaps section in the implementation part of the report where we called out some gaps that you all identified in the vulnerability study or vulnerability analysis that was done, I think in 2020, or maybe it was just last year. Last year. So those are also listed there, and maybe we can talk about how this can play a role. I know I think we're going a little bit over, and there are other things you all wanted to discuss. So maybe I don't know if maybe it would make more sense for you all to provide written comments later to Anya so she can share with the team.
That's the last page, right? This is the last page of the chart. Yeah.
That is the last page of the chart. Yeah. So updating shoreline management plan and the multi-jurisdictional hazard mitigation plan.
Can you go back one page?
Yep.
Just a comment on 3.2.1. It appears to be either redundant or might be better combined with 1.1.7 or 1.1.8. I mean, generally when you apply for permits, there's a checklist involved, and just to me, it just seems like it's redundant to those two other paragraphs.
Okay, so just to repeat, 3.2.1 redundant with what were the actions you listed after?
1.1.7.
And 1.1.8.
Yeah, either one or both. It just seems to be a repeat of or could be combined or added to those.
That's the one about the development standards and the planning guidelines. So yeah, we can look at that.
Yeah, it's just talking about adding a checklist about resiliency into the planning process. It seems like it would be better combined with those or added to those.
Yeah, that makes sense, actually.
Maybe those move down here because they're about standards, and we don't have to talk about it right now.
Right.
Okay, great. Any other comments on this last page for now?
My quick comment would be the same thing that we talked about with the Mission Trail Master Plan needs to apply to the Shoreline Management Plan. So we should just sequentially order these things and sort of put dates on them, maybe one every other year, and then include a line for the monitoring as well. However it is that Hannes thinks we should do that.
Great. So that was all the tables. I think it's worth just mentioning for, just a couple of minutes what's in the implementation and monitoring section of the plan, because I think it's, one of the more important pieces following those tables, which has implementation roles and responsibilities for the city, partners, and lists all the partners, role of business and residents. We also have funding and financing mechanisms, and then monitoring and evaluation plan, which includes reporting on progress. And we've kind of talked about this earlier about reporting annually and having that be the role of the climate coordinator or grant writer. So yeah, I'm just looking forward to seeing comments on these sections as well.
Right, actually, I did want to pause right here because Lynette did bring up the concern about who the overseeing elected body might be that would help keep track of progress on this adaptation planning effort. And I didn't want to lose it because I just paused it during when we were talking about the table, but I think now might be sort of a good time to sort of discuss that issue with having several potentially overlapping commissions. And so we put in the report the planning commission, but this was, subject to discussion of the group. So I just wanted to make sure that we had a few minutes to discuss that and the concerns around that.
And everybody speak at
Yes,
once.
did you want me to say what I wrote to you, or does everybody already know that?
It might be, I did not forward to everyone else. So I think it might be worth sharing with the group what your concerns were.
Okay, I just made some comments on the draft generally, but then I said, additionally, however, I have a concern about the Planning Commission being given the responsibility indicated in the document. I didn't realize that had been decided, and I believe that should not be the Planning Commission. Whereas the Planning Commission has the responsibility for the built environment, it is Forest and Beach that has the responsibility for the natural environment, and community affairs or community activities and cultural affairs has the responsibility for more of the community elements. In my opinion, to rest the full responsibility on the Planning Commission is a false construct. It gives this commission power over the elements that rightfully are in the purview of other entities. Such an arrangement is fraught with the potential for territoriality and unnecessary tension among the commissions. While I understand that when something is everybody's responsibility, it is actually nobody's responsibility, I can imagine a structure of co-leadership and co-responsibility that would produce real cooperation among these commissions. Such a partnership would contribute to a greater penetration of awareness and involvement in the projects, programs, and plans related to adaptation and action as recommended in these plans that we're looking at. So that's what I sent along with my general comments about the document. And so there it is.
So I think Jeff had some thoughts on that. I would recommend that there be one entity that be the lead, only because as you mentioned, if it's everybody's plan, it's nobody's plan. And we would potentially, I think there needs to be one lead. I don't think there should be only one reviewing agency, because some of these actions obviously affect other commissions, and we would want to get feedback from other commissions on, you know, say Forest and Beach for things that have to do with the beach or the forest, obviously. However, I do feel like there needs to be one primary in terms of, especially that would, you know, provide feedback on progress. That's my take as staff, obviously, but, you know, we're very much open to different opinions.
I agree with, you know, Agnes and I talked about that. We've talked about this a couple of times, and I agree that with her sort of overall assessment, which I think is the most important assessment, that one commission, one body should be responsible for all of these efforts. And I know what I heard you say was that you're worried a little bit about territoriality between sort of the Planning Commission and the Forest and Beach Commission and the community activities. But we do seem to manage that okay right now. We do have some intersection between the Planning Commission and the Forest and Beach Commission. And while it's not always smooth, I think people understand that, you know, it's sort of a shared effort. And I'm okay with it being sort of a shared effort the way it is right now. I think the question then is where, for me, you know, having made sort of that assumption, the question is then where to put it. Before last month when we were talking about this, we had, you know, there was an item on the council agenda, which was to sort of bifurcate the Planning Commission into sort of a Planning Commission and a Design Review Board that would free up some commissioners' times to do more planning, which is basically what this document espouses. You know, it's a lot of planning. Unfortunately, that effort got sort of put on hold in view of the fact that the city is embarking on this design review guide, the revision of the design review guidance effort. And I think most of the council, me excluded, I did not agree with this decision, but that's completely okay, decided to wait until that design review, the design traditions project is completed before they worry about splitting off the design review board. And so I think that the sort of Planning Commission with capacity is probably a couple of years off. So we could give this to the Planning Commission. I think that the end result, and I'm looking to see if Michael appears or doesn't. I think if we gave this to the Planning Commission, I think the end result would be less than optimal, I think, than what we are all expecting. So one idea, you know, that we, you know, I sort of hatched, or Agnes and I hatched, or me and some other people sort of hatched, was to instead establish some sort of sustainability committee, which would have oversight into the elements of this plan. And so rather than it being forest and beach or community activities or planning, it would be some new committee. And I see that Michael has appeared and raised his hand, so I'll let him speak to this.
Get unmuted here. You know, one thing that I don't hear in this conversation is the load on staff. I mean, a lot of what the Planning Commission does, in fact, everything that the Planning Commission does is, and it's on our agenda, has you know, staff reports that go along with it. So you know, a lot of this gets back to staff, and I just think that needs to be considered in this conversation. So
I would say that, you know, we did, Carrie and I have both, I think, talked to Chip about getting an additional staff person to sort of monitor this committee. So I think monitor the work that we've sort of outlined here. So I think that assuming that happens, and that's really sort of a bad assumption, but you know, we shouldn't make assumptions, but assuming that happens, I think that the staff time is sort of covered. I think that staff time in dealing with these projects and dealing with managing a commission, I'm hopeful that those concerns of yours would be alleviated by that additional person. which would bring us back to the original question of where should that staff person report into? Should it be the Planning Commission, the Sustainability Commission, or some other, the City Council? It could be the City Council, for example, and all this could go to the City Council, though I definitely do not think that's the right place.
Well, part of the process right now, it's sort of a process of the specific committees or boards kind of making recommendations to the next board that's going to review it. And so that's kind of how the process works now. So a lot of what we're doing at the Planning Commission, our meetings, Forest and Beach is already giving the input specifically on, trees that have to be planted or removed and how they're going to be treated. And, one of the things I've heard in the conversation here today seems like the overreaching theme is, how are we going to implement this? Who's going to be accountable? And what's going to have to happen is the city's really going to have to step up with allocating more of their budget for, this adaptation and mitigation process, and how they get personnel, into the city that are hired to do this work. Because right now, I think everybody's pretty much operating at their maximum capacity just to deal with a lot of the permitting process, a lot of the capital improvement projects that are here. So I think it's really going to require a big discussion at the council on how they're going to come up with the money to hire the personnel to get the focus on these projects that needs to be done.
So assuming that the council has that discussion and it works out satisfactorily for the purposes of this, where do you think the oversight should be? Which body?
Well, first of all, the Planning Commission, we review the capital improvement projects just to make sure that they're, in line with the general plan, but we don't do any allocation of the funds. So, and mostly what we're doing is permit review, for coastal development permits or building permits, or use permits. That's pretty much what we do. We do, I know, Jeff, you've made the comment many times that the Planning Commission doesn't do any planning, but we're busy most of the time trying to develop, work with this permitting process. We do have, we break down into subcommittees periodically to review, what you would call planning issues, have to do with, interim reviews on, the guidelines and the municipal code. But, the bulk of our energy and time goes into reviewing, permits, whether they be those I've talked about. So a lot of this adaptation plan has to do with hiring professionals that we need to provide reports about, specifically what we're going to have to do. Like Scott was mentioning about sea level rise, making a determination of what we're going to have to do to the seawalls down at the beach so that they can handle the levels of sea level rise, which we're expecting. How are we going to, what are we going to need to do to adapt our forests to this, and so forth. So I think those types of things are going to, it seems to me it's going to have to be a shared responsibility within all of the city review bodies, elected bodies, and boards and commissions. It's, there's a lot of work here to go around.
So
in our present form, if we have a committee, a specific committee, a climate change sustainability committee, then they can just focus on that, a lot of specifics in the plan, but still, to get the funding, to get the proper review from all of the different, boards and commissions, what they normally do, it's going to require some coordination, between all of these committees and boards.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing is we're not really necessarily getting to the question of who's overseeing sort of the progress at the moment. I would say it ideally would have a sustainability commission. My concern is I definitely hear Michael's comment about, that we have staff capacity, because even with a new person, if it's a commission that meets on a monthly basis, that's a significant amount of staff time spent on, preparing agendas and all of that. So I would guard against doing something that's a little too ambitious, but if it was a new commission that could meet once every 6 months or something like that, just to keep the progress moving forward, I could see that being something that we could recommend, so that there is a commission that maybe would become sort of a future planning commission, as time goes on, if it does seem to be a productive use of a new commission.
I would have suggested once every 2 months, so maybe we could compromise on once every 3 months and sort of put that recommendation on paper and see if it flies through till next month.
Okay. Now, should we put that as a recommendation in the implementation section of the report, and then we will see how City Council feels about this when we present it to Council?
Yeah, why don't we
I'd
do
be
that?
really satisfied with that.
Mm-hmm. I think the commission, a specific commission, really is the way to go. And a quarterly meeting would, I think I'm comfortable with that.
All right.
Why don't we try it on for size before next month, for next month's report?
Okay, I wasn't planning. We're starting to get down to the wire as far as if we're trying to get it to planning and Forest and Beach commissions in May. So I'm happy to make that change. I'm just hoping that we don't make a lot of changes at the next meeting, just because we're just getting down to the wire here. So, and I don't want to have to delay some of these meetings because we need to make.
Yeah, I'm scheduling these sort of construction trade outreach meetings for right after the next meeting. So I'm also hoping that the next version will stick.
Okay. All right, sounds good. Okay, great. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
We were going to give everybody a couple of weeks to give us comments. But we obviously, since we need to come back to, put this on the agenda at the next meeting, we definitely need it. I might actually give it a week and a half for comments so that we have time to make the edits and include it in the agenda for the next meeting.
Can you, I know we volunteered Lynette and Scott to do that work with the sea level rise stuff. Maybe you could send us sort of an update in a couple of weeks, like an updated plan if you have any work done. If you don't, then you don't. But if you do, maybe we could see are we all allowed to see a version before the next meeting? Maybe that's not allowed.
I don't think we can do that. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Well, it'll be great.
Great. Thanks as always, everyone, for having us. We really enjoy coming to your meetings. It's always such a great discussion. So yeah, looking forward to seeing all of your comments in the next week and a half, and we'll be back with another version.
Thank you.
Right. Thank you, guys.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.
Bye. All right. So is Michael still here?
Yes,
Yeah.
I am.
Next time we're putting Michael first.
I know. Sorry, Michael.
I think we better put Michael first.
I don't know. What am I in for here? That.
But we only have 31 minutes left, so you're not in for 2 hours.
Okay.
All right. So I take it you've all seen the technical memorandum that includes not just the inventories and forecasts with the new VMT numbers, but also the reduction measures and the quantification of those reduction measures in comparison with the targets. I wanted to highlight just some minor changes that Agnes and I went through on the actions themselves. And it's just really minor wording. And I'll focus on goals 1 through 4. In particular, wherever we talked about promoting energy efficiency resource centers, that has been slightly reworded to really explicitly talk about the PG&E energy centers that they provide that gives you energy efficiency audits, rebates, incentive programs, and highlights those things for the communities within PG&E's territory. Another one where there was energy efficiency audits for residential and commercial being done by 3CE. 3CE, as it turns out, does not do those, but PG&E does. So we've just changed from 3CE to PG&E. And wherever we talk about streamlining online permitting, we just changed that to evaluate the feasibility of providing streamlined online permitting, because I believe Agnes has some work to do there. Well, the city has some work to do there to make that happen. So all of that appears in goals 1 through 4. Goal 1 and 2 is on residential, 3 and 4 is on commercial. One other thing, wherever we talk about on goal 1 in particular, requiring existing residential homes that are going through a major renovation or addition, we don't quantify that. The city is still evaluating exactly what percentage of the home would constitute a major home revision or renovation. And the same for commercial. I think in the earlier version, we had like a 70% of the footprint of the building, and that the city just wants to make sure that's consistent with other provisions that the city has. So they are evaluating exactly what that percentage would be. I'll say that, go ahead.
I would just add that we may not just do it based on a percentage, but it may also be based on the type of renovation that is done on a project. So if they do a full kitchen remodel, then that is automatically a part of it. Whereas if they're just doing, mostly living room and bedroom retrofits where, those types of the appliances wouldn't necessarily come into play, we might not require it then. So it was really just giving us a little bit of flexibility to determine the best situations where to require those retrofits.
And that requirement, if you remember, is a major portion of the emissions reduction associated with building energy, requiring them to electrify, not have natural gas. So it makes total sense. If you're renovating a kitchen, that's the time to do that, because 99% of your gas is in the kitchen. So moving on to goal 5, I'm going through this really quickly so we have some time for discussion and questions. Goal 5 had the statement of require low flow irrigation lands and low water using landscape. It's been changed to continue the low flow irrigation landscaping requirements that the city already has in place. There's nothing really changing there. There was some actions about looking into rainwater harvesting and gray water systems. That would be new, and it sounds like there's some overlap with the adaptation measure on that particular one. Other minor changes had to do with preferential parking. So provide preferential, reserve preferential parking spaces for ride share, carpooling, and ultra low or zero emission vehicles. That would be in city-owned parking lots, and those parking lots where businesses had their own reserved employee parking. And then where we have reserving priority parking for electric vehicles at hotels, instead of, the city can't really require the hotels to do that, but promote or encourage hotels to do that. So none of this, all of this wordsmithing, none of it has changed any of the quantifications. I would say up front too that AMBAG provided some comments on the technical memorandum, just basically requesting that we provide more details in what they do as far as transportation modeling and how they did that. And both Agnes and I are fully in agreement with everything they asked. So that technical memo will be edited to include all of AMBAG's information on the transportation sector.
And one more, we did remove one measure or one action because at the last meeting we had discussed that that might not be a preferred option at the city. It was the use of reflective pavement.
Oh, that's right. Thank you for reminding me of that. The cool pavement. Right now, the state of cool pavement is in such a state that you couldn't really do it right now. I suspect as time moves on, the technology of that will improve. So cool pavements off, and cool roofs, we didn't quantify much of anything because you really need to change the codes to allow more flexibility with cool roof material. There were 2 comment letters, and before we get into those, I was going to ask for any questions or comments on the technical memorandum as you saw it, plus these changes we talked about. So I briefly discussed the AMBAG letter, and there is nothing there that I would disagree with. It just provides more details on the transportation sector and how it's calculated. I would also say that AMBAG is doing a fantastic job and service for you guys. On the transportation sector in itself, they have a lot of demands on what their transportation modeling needs to do. Providing climate action planning is just one aspect of it. If you'll note that while we did alter the VMT a bit, all of the other sectors is exactly as AMBAG had provided. And I would encourage you to continue using AMBAG's services here because it is saving the city a lot of money, and you are being consistent with all of the other jurisdictions in the area by doing that. So the second letter was through Landwatch, and let me bring that up so I can discuss that a bit. Give me just a minute. So Landwatch provided a brief comment letter, and they they really like the idea that you are endeavoring on a climate action and adaptation plan. They like the idea of having a designated staff member that is going to monitor and track the plans, as well as pursue grants. That is actually a really vital, my own experience is that's a vital person to have. If you have somebody that's dedicated to that, climate action plans tend to get implemented. If there's nobody doing that, nobody's watching or monitoring. So having somebody dedicated to that, and it takes somebody really full-time dedicated to that to make it happen. They also talked about the plan eventually being a GHG reduction plan under CEQA guidelines 15183.5. I do not recommend that the city of Carmel pursue having a CEQA qualified plan. Primarily, the reductions are coming from the existing built environment. If there was a lot of new development going on, then that might be a possibility, but the added expense and just effort of making this a qualified plan, doing a CEQA review of it, I would encourage the city, rather than go that path, to really put those resources into the implementation of the plan. And like I say, the reason for that is that there's not a lot of benefit to the city in having a CEQA qualified plan, since very few, if any, of the new development occurring in the city actually qualifies as a project under CEQA. Most of what you do have as far as intermittent new development winds up being exempt from CEQA. And a lot like the home renovations, that kind of thing, is not considered a project under CEQA. So the focus here should be on how you can implement this plan and putting the resources and money into that. Having said that, there's a couple of things I wanted to talk about in their recommendations if you were to go a CEQA plan, because even though I don't recommend you going a CEQA plan, there are some good things there. The first one they talk about is having a long-term goal of carbon neutrality by 2035, rather than only a near-term goal of 2030 goal. I recommend having a 2030 reduction target, which is pretty hard and fast, and the reduction measures focus on that. I see that as a first step for the city of Carmel in going over to that long-term goal of carbon neutrality. I would actually recommend that as you develop a climate action plan, that you have this long-term goal in mind and how you set up the city for achieving carbon neutrality. But at this first step, focus on achieving those 2030 goals. And as this plan gets monitored, you're going to see reduction measures that work really well and those that don't. So really in like 3 years, 2 years, revisit those and revise the plan to achieve those targets. The problem with actually setting reduction measures and having a hard and fast reduction target towards carbon neutrality is that there's a lot of things outside of the control of the city that you would need to do in order to achieve carbon neutrality, unless you do carbon offsets or something. So as an example, you can certainly encourage and implement a lot of the infrastructure for electric vehicles to replace internal combustion engines. But you can't require that only electric vehicles run in the city. There's just no way for the city to have jurisdictional control over that. You can certainly incentivize and encourage your residents to convert to all electric build homes rather than having natural gas. But there's nothing that the city has as a hook to require them to go to all electric at this point. There are things that the state can do that can help you with that. One of the things that the state has in its current scoping plan is GHG, or excuse me, carbon dioxide removal projects, and not just sequestration, but actually mechanical devices that would remove carbon from the atmosphere and sequester it in geological formations and other ways. That is something well beyond what the city is capable of doing or tasked with doing. So working in concert with the state towards getting to that carbon neutrality goal is a really important aspect of that. But setting that as a hard and fast target and trying to come up with reduction measures that get you there is not really feasible for the city at this time. They also state that substantial evidence is needed to provide the evidence, if you will, that the reductions will actually be achieved. And that is in the spreadsheet that I provided Anya's, but is not in the technical memo. I think that'll be in appendices to the technical memo, actually.
Okay.
The last, there was one other thing where they talked about the language. It relies too much on hortatory language. That's voluntary actions, if you will. And the issue here is because it's the built environment, there is a lot of promoting and encouraging to entice people that the city has no way of actually requiring them to do things, but through like the Green Citizens program or the Green Visitor program, really encouraging them to initiate some of the renovations they need in their homes or the way they travel for the visitors traveling there. So you can't really get rid of the encourage and promote just because of the situation that the city is in. Certainly, if new development comes along, there's a hook there to require them. And for the major emission reductions, such as electrification for major renovations of commercial and residential, it is not encouraged. But for those places where that is really the best way for the city to entice its citizens and business owners to convert their businesses and homes to all electric, to providing solar, to having electric vehicle chargers and electric vehicles. We have to have that language because it is, at the end of the day, voluntary. So those are my quick responses to the Landwatch letter. I'll open it up for questions.
Anyone before I start?
Yeah, I just had a quick one on Michael on that. Thank you for that overview. That was very helpful in going through the Landwatch memo, by the way. Appreciate that. Just a quick one, you're talking about what we can sort of require or not. And I'm just trying to think about something that was outside of the scope of what you mentioned, like say, for example, burning wood in fireplaces. I mean, that's not, there's no new construction. Can't we make those sorts of requests? I know that's not a big greenhouse gas reduction item, but I'm just trying to get a sense for where we can and cannot require things of our community.
Typically, we can't require any modifications to a building until they come in for a building permit.
Okay.
So that's sort of where
the line. Yeah.
the encouraging versus the requiring. So whenever there's a buildings, whenever there's a proposed project, then we can start putting in all of our requirements. But as long as there isn't a proposed project and there's just an existing, building, we really don't have a way to require modifications like that.
Okay.
And that's where the encouraging is really important. And peer pressure from all of you on your neighbors to
and it does actually work. I mean, peer pressure does make a difference. So I know Landwash is concerned about encouraging, but that's how a lot of environmental changes have happened over time, is by peer pressure. People seeing what other people are doing and wanting to be as good or better.
Yeah. My prediction here is that the technology and the changes in the market are such that it's going in your favor. Electric vehicles are going to be the future, and all electric homes and businesses are going to be much more affordable than keeping natural gas into the future. So fossil fuels are something that is becoming more and more passé in the marketplace. So you have that advantage.
We're all going to get golf carts like the one that Carrie had at her hotel. I have a couple of questions for you, Michael.
Yes.
And on page 23 of your report, which is on page 260 of the agenda packet, there's a nice chart that shows greenhouse gas reductions from like 2015 to 2019, 2020, which is where we are, down to 2045. And there's a green section, a blue section, and a red line section.
Yes.
The blue section. So having focused you on that, now could you turn to page 18 of your report? And 18 is table N, goal 7, which is decrease greenhouse gas emissions through reducing VMT in electric vehicles. Is the blue section of your graph on page 23, does that reduction correspond with scope 1 and scope 3 of the width enhancing column? So that would be 2,990 tons. Is that right?
Those numbers are right.
Scope 1 and scope 3.
Yeah. So the graph that you saw only has scope 1 emissions in it. It does not include scope 3. And the reason for that is emissions that you are voluntarily watching and reducing. They are not associated with the reduction target, which really focuses on those things that are scope 1 and 2 emissions that are required of a climate action plan. So if we were to include scope 3, you would see that blue line come down a little further. You'd still have the red hatch going towards 2045, but you'd see that blue line going down farther.
Okay, so my one thing that would clear this up for me is if that graph was clear about what the blue section represents. So scope 1, but not scope 3. So that's sort of my question to you. And my other question is sort of the same thing. On page 22, which is the previous page, there's a pie chart.
Yes.
And I don't know, it could be my old eyes, my nearsighted eyes, but I cannot make out the legend. I cannot figure out which pieces of the legend apply to which pieces of the pie. Like there are too many, for me, there are too many shades of blue to figure out which is 30% and which is 19%. I really couldn't do it. And this applies to the chart that's on page, there's another pie chart on page,
Maybe we can just put call outs for each of the pie pieces.
yeah. And we fixed, I think we fixed the ones that are on page 6. I think I had this objection before, and I think we fixed the one that was on page 6, the 2 that are on page 6.
Yes.
But we didn't really fix the one on page 7, and I know that those are small. I know that those sections are small, but I can't figure it out. Like I can't. I was unable to piece it together. So if you could fix that for me as a personal favor.
Sure. My eyes are having issues with that too. So just having the labels along with the percentage amounts in each of the pie sections
however it is that you
would help a lot.
However it is that you do it would be.
Yeah. We did that with the PowerPoint and did not put it in here. So that's an easy fix.
And then my only other comment was, and we had a pretty robust discussion about this when we were talking about the adaptation plan, was that the actions still seem, and I think this goes a little bit to what Landwatch was saying, but maybe not really. The actions still seem a little bit nebulous to me. Like they don't have dates on them, and they don't, like, for example, one of the actions on page 18 is require or incentivize major commercial building renovations to install e-chargers. Actually, that's a bad example, but I'll just use that one. What happens if, like, when do we have to have that done to meet the 1,538 tons of greenhouse gas emissions reduced? Like, I don't, like the actions have a measure of time involved in how long it takes us to do something. Like, do we need to do all these actions next year to meet these targets? Like, how do we phase them in to make sure that we meet the targets that are in the graphs? Does that make sense? Like, there's no time, there's no time schedule associated with them.
So, and I can tell you verbally that the time schedule is to have that done in a way that in 2030, when you do an inventory update, you will see those reductions. So if you have all of those actions completed by, say, January of 2030, by the end of January, or by the end of 2030, December 31st, 2030, when you go and do an inventory update and you're monitoring the plan, you should have achieved those full reductions.
Okay, let me choose an example that really matters then. On page 14, it says, on page, let's just use the one we all talked about. On page 12, one of the actions is develop a REACH code to require major home renovations to convert to all electric homes. And it makes, my thinking is that it makes a pretty significant difference whether we have this REACH code in effect a year from now or 10 years from now, as to whether we'll make the 1,294 ton reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, right? Because if we do it 10 years from now, we've missed 9 years of home conversions in getting them into an all electric system.
Yes, and if you'll notice, that's the phasing is in 2 to 4 years. So not immediately tomorrow, that there takes some time to get that REACH code approved, but
okay,
pretty quickly in the time frame, 2 to 4 years.
So this plan then is really a short and medium term plan. Like, these are all things we need to do in the next 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 years. Like on page 14, it's 3 to 5 years. Yes. So these are all things we need to do in a pretty short time frame to reach our goals.
Yes, by doing those, especially where you're developing a REACH code, you need to do fairly soon. I think the longest term one was a general plan update for intensifying the land use around the city center. That one was 2 to 10 years. And that's just because the general plan itself.
Yeah,
but go ahead.
I was going to say, I think in terms of how we prioritize these tasks, And that'll show up probably a little more once we have the climate action plan together. But the way that I'm looking at prioritizing is choosing those tasks that have the highest greenhouse gas reduction potential, prioritizing those, and then adding on the supporting measures as we can, because that's how we're going to get the best bang for our buck, probably.
And I wouldn't underestimate the supporting measures. So that peer pressure you talked about really comes out of those supporting measures. You don't see any emission reductions associated with them, but it is helpful to do.
Mm-hmm.
So my recommendation when you're looking at actually what is most important, certainly the ones with the highest GHG reductions, but also the ones that are just really easy to undertake. So as an example, promoting PG&E's Energy Center, there's not a lot of work involved in that. Just coordinating with PG&E, and the same with the energy audits, which are going to get you at those residential units that may not be going through major renovations, but encouraging those folks to do the energy efficiency upgrades.
So Agnes, you mentioned dates just a second ago, and you think that the plan that we'll see next month will have some dates associated with them?
Yeah, that's the goal. The goal is to have a plan that sort of would be somewhat similar in structure as the adaptation plan, and will rely on some of the information in the adaptation plan, as well as obviously it'll rely on this memo for actions. But since we want the two plans to sort of get implemented side by side in tandem with each other, I think it's going to rely a lot on similar sort of as the adaptation plan. Yeah.
Okay. Are we finished with this item? Any questions for Michael? Or I suspect, Agnes, that we'll have more questions next month when we see the plan.
Yeah.
And I think Michael LePage and John Hill and I are certainly going to do start our construction trade outreach after next month. And I hope everybody else is working on their constituent organizations as well. Okay. Thank you, Michael. Thanks for staying. Thanks for staying until the end.
Thank you.
Fair enough.
I promise we'll schedule you at the beginning next time.
All right. Hey, thanks a lot.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks, Michael.
And the last quick item on the agenda was what to do about, we had the discussion before that led to sort of that maybe not sustainability committee, but what should we do with respect to the sea level rise and the 1.1 version of this report? Who should we have on this report to for the next year until the sustainability committee comes? Should it be until the sustainability committee hopefully comes? We could give it to the city council, and that would hold their feet to the fire to get the sustainability committee done. Maybe that's a good strategy. I see Carrie smiling. So maybe that's a good strategy. We could keep this committee around for another year. Don't everybody volunteer at once. I see that Michael LePage's camera's going on and off, so it's probably his reflection of that. What do you all think?
Yeah, I'm sorry, Jeff. I lost my connection there for a minute. I didn't hear what you were saying at the end.
Which committee should be responsible for overseeing the version 1.1 of the report, which has the sea level rise work in it, hopefully has the sea level rise work in it. If it's not us, like I'm presuming that we're going to disband after the version 1.0 of the report. Now, we could not disband and keep this committee around on a reduced meeting schedule while that happens. If you all are game for that, that would be an okay plan by me. And I'm sure the council would be fine with that. So we could do that. Or we could try to hand off our 1.1 responsibilities to someone else, some other group.
Jeff,
I'm kind
just
of
for
a mind that,
oh,
I'm
sorry.
sorry. Excuse me, Lynette. Go ahead, Lynette.
Thank you. Just for clarification purposes, are you expecting 1.1 to be within the next year, or at this time next year it'll be done, or longer than that? Because you're talking about a year, right?
Yeah, and I'm wondering, now you've got me wondering. My assumption was that it would, you know, if we got the money approved, that it would take a couple of months to procure a consultant to do the work, some additional number of months to do the work, and then some number of months to revise the report. And now that you say that, we're looking at Anya's face here. Now that you say that, I'm thinking that maybe this is more than a year project. What do you think?
I think it's at least a year and a half, probably.
Mm-hmm.
I would say it's even longer if you're talking about getting to those policy options. That was what I was trying to make earlier. I mean, I'm not sure what 1.1 is. You know, just getting the geology is just one small piece of a big, long project. So, I mean, it's okay to have interim steps and things, but and to call it 1.1 interim step, that seems reasonable. But I would say it's a multi-year effort at the end of the day.
I think Scott's right. I feel like there are pieces of it that could be reported on in a year, but the kind of penetration into so many aspects of the city's life that a sea level rise study would entail feels like multi-year. And 18 months, Agnes, are you saying to complete the mechanics and the study and getting that? Yeah. Then I think it's longer. And maybe there's a transition from this committee to a new committee. Some members staying on, other members maybe not. But I feel like some continuity is important.
I agree with Lynette. I was going to say that I think it's important that this committee stay together and, you know, have a longer meeting schedule, you know, the period of meeting, you know, the frequency of meeting be longer, but there's, you know, everybody here's done a lot of work already. They're familiar with the reports, and to just disband, I think that would be a loss of focus for the city.
Yeah, I do too.
So right now, this committee is in the best position to understand whether or not, you know, we're making any progress on what we're proposing.
So your proposal would be, your thoughts are that, not necessarily a proposal, your thoughts are that we should stay together as a committee until, you know, if and until the sustainability committee sort of comes about.
Yeah, that would be
the committee that we were just talking about.
Yes.
And maybe some of the people that are on this committee would be on that sustainability commission or whatever it's called, board or whatever. And certainly staff, I mean, Agnes and you know, and Evan would be.
The big issue with that is just getting the okay from all six of us. You know, Carrie's probably, you know, I don't know, you know, I think Carrie has, you know, is not going to run as far as she's told me. I don't think that's a surprise to anybody. And I may not be reelected. And then there are four of you that have done well above, beyond sort of the original call of duty. So I don't want to make any presumptions on sort of the city's call on your time.
Well, I think it comes with the understanding that anybody can resign at any time.
Mhm.
I mean, you're not, this isn't a sentence. And I think everybody that has served here has served because of their commitment to this issue. And so, we understand, the gravity and the magnitude of this challenge.
Mhm.
And my point is that, all of you here have done a lot of work. We've all learned a lot through this process. I know I have learned a lot. And I just would hate to see that all of a sudden just disband. Now, if somebody has personal situations that are coming up, fine, those should be honored. And if you need to, you've got another commitment, or you're tired of, doing something. I mean, elected officials, yeah, you're going to come and go. I mean, I'm not going to serve forever on the planning commission. At some point I'll not be doing that. And I'm sure, each one of you two council members will probably decide you're not going to do that. The paid employees like Anya's and Evan, they have a little more criteria in their decisions whether or not they do something or don't do it. But so I just think that there's a lot we should stay together. And I think if we don't have to meet. We've done a lot of work already. A lot of good work has been done, and we need to put it out there in the community and get some things happening, and then maybe come back together to see if the metrics are being met. We had a lot of talk about the metrics tonight.
I'm wondering if some of the committee members would be interested in and actually being involved in implementation of some of the actions in there, because quite a few of the actions are very community oriented. It may be something that some of the committee members might be interested in.
Yeah, I definitely would. I mean, you need a block person, captain or whatever it was called,
Yeah, that's a good point. Mm-hmm.
Like, that's an easy thing for me to do.
And there was the Firewise community sort of preparedness, which was another thing that's very community oriented. That may be another item that committee members might be interested in.
Yeah, Visit Carmel is already looking at destination stewardship. So this ties into that. So, I understand. I mean, this committee is a very dedicated committee. So I understand the willingness to want to make sure this comes to fruition. That makes sense to me. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we'll just leave it. I guess that's the answer then. We'll just leave it in place and sort of worry about the odd changes as they happen.
Mm-hmm.
Odd personnel changes as they happen.
Yeah, worry about those as they come, as they say, address them as they come.
And then presumably after we sort of finish with the city council in September, whenever that is, we'll go to a sort of reduced meeting frequency.
But that won't limit our recommendation for a sustainability board, group, commission go forward, will it?
Yeah, I think when that happens, then this committee would just morph into that one.
Yeah.
That's my understanding anyway. And however long it takes for that to happen, we would stick around until then.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm good with that.
That sounds good.
Okay.
Great discussion.
Thank you all for
today.
sticking in there. Appreciate it a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Bye-bye.
Okay,
Thank you.
Thanks,
everyone.
everybody.
See you
Thank you.
next meeting.
Good work.